The parking lot outside Vero Motors headquarters on launch morning looked like someone had arranged it specifically for a magazine shoot. 63 cars. Not a single one under $80,000. There were matte black SUVs with tinted everything, a silver coupe that reflected the morning sky like a mirror, two identical charcoal sedans that cost more than most people's first homes combined. The security team wore earpieces. The catering staff wore uniforms. Even the banner draped above the entrance, Vero GT9, "The future moves first," had been designed by a firm that charged per letter and invoiced with enthusiasm. It was that kind of morning. And into that parking lot, at exactly 8:47 in the morning, crawled a 2001 Dodge Ram pickup, truck the color of dried rust and quiet regret. The exhaust note was distinctive. Not in a good way. It was the sound of a vehicle that had survived 11 winters, 2 minor floods, and at least one incident involving a highway drainage ditch that the owner had never fully explained to anyone. The left rear panel had a crease in it that could charitably be described as character. The hood had a patch of primer that had been waiting to become paint for approximately 4 years. The passenger side window had a crack that started in the upper left corner and traveled diagonally to the center like a tiny fault line running through the cab. The truck pulled into a space between a pearl-white luxury crossover and a British racing green sports coupe. It sat there for a moment, engine ticking in the morning silence, before the door opened. Mace Cole stepped out. He was 38 years old, 6 feet exactly. He wore dark work pants, a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed up, and boots that had seen the inside of enough engine bays to tell their own story. He wasn't dressed poorly. Everything was clean, everything fit, but next to the people filing into the Vero reveal event in their blazers and Italian leather shoes, he looked like a man who had shown up to a wedding directly from fixing something important, which was, in a very specific way, accurate. He reached back into the cab and unbuckled Eastlaw from the back seat. Eastlaw Cole was 8 years old and possessed the kind of face that looked permanently amused by the world's inability to get things right. She wore a small backpack with a cartoon wrench stitched on the front, a birthday present she had specifically requested, explaining to her grandmother that she liked tools, and, also it's funny. She landed on the asphalt with a hop, looked around the parking lot with wide eyes, and then looked up at her father. "Dad," she said, "our truck looks like it's embarrassed to be here." Mace looked at it. "The truck is fine. The truck is crying," she said. He took her hand, and they walked toward the entrance. The morning had started the way most of their mornings started, with breakfast, a missing hair tie, and a negotiation about whether oatmeal counted as a food Eastlaw enjoyed or merely tolerated. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that was older than fashionable but newer than historic, which meant it existed in the architectural middle ground of simply being a place people lived. Mace had been there for 6 years, since he'd moved back to the city after leaving his position at Halsey Engineering and needed somewhere with good light and enough room for a daughter. The rotating collection of mechanical reference texts that occupied 2 full bookshelves and the top of the refrigerator. The kitchen was small and organized. The living room had a couch, a low table covered in engineering journals, and one stuffed elephant that Eastlaw had named Gerald for reasons she no longer remembered but refused to revisit, and a wall near the window where Eastlaw taped her drawings. There were 41 drawings on that wall. Mace had counted them once. He had not removed a single one. He made eggs. He made toast. He listened to Eastlaw's detailed account of a disagreement between 2 of her friends at school that had something to do with whose turn it was to name the class plant. And he tracked the narrative with the genuine engagement of a man who understood that the things small people find important are important precisely because they find them so. "What did you name it?" he asked. "I wasn't involved in the dispute," Eastlaw said, with the composure of someone who had removed herself from drama for diplomatic reasons and wanted credit for the restraint. "But privately, I think Gerald was a strong candidate." He looked at the stuffed elephant. "I see a theme," he said. "Gerald is a good name for things," she said simply. He handed her toast. She ate it standing up, looking out the kitchen window at the street below, the way she always did in the mornings, quietly taking inventory of the world before agreeing to enter it. He had gotten the invitation to the GT9 launch 2 weeks earlier. It had come through a channel he hadn't used in years, an old professional listing attached to the platform IP sale documentation, which apparently someone at Vero's marketing department had pulled from the acquisition records and included in a broad media and industry invite. It was almost certainly an administrative oversight. Someone had scraped the original Halcyon contact files and added everyone without checking what roles they'd actually played. He could have not gone. His schedule that day was a full diagnostic on a fleet manager's refrigerated delivery van and 2 hours of consultations on a community college robotics program he'd been quietly advising for the past year. Neither was inflexible, but he was curious. He had been curious about the GT9 since he'd seen the teaser imagery 8 months ago. The angles, the proportions, the specific way the lower chassis met the wheel arch. He had recognized the geometry the way you recognize handwriting. You don't need to be told whose it is. Your eye simply knows. And Isla had asked if they could go to the car show. He'd explained it wasn't exactly a car show. She'd said close enough. Wear your good boots, he'd told her the night before, pulling her backpack from the hook by the door. The ones with the flowers or the ones with the stars? The ones that fit, he'd said. She'd worn the stars. They had almost made it to the registration desk when the laughter started. Not all at once. It began the way laughter in rooms like that always begins. A low murmur between two people who assume they're being quiet but aren't. A sharp exhale from someone else. And then the little expanding ripple of amusement that rolls through a crowd when they've collectively found something that confirms what they already thought. What they thought, apparently, was that a man in a Henley who had arrived in a rusted Dodge Ram with a little girl carrying a cartoon wrench backpack was not supposed to be here. Sir, the voice came from a man standing near the entrance with the particular posture of someone who had been given a clipboard and had let that change him. He was mid-30s, wore a lanyard, and looked at Mace the way customs officers look at passports they've already decided are suspicious. This is a credentialed event. Press and industry partners only. I have a name on the list, Mace said. He gave it. The man checked. He checked it twice. His expression did the small, involuntary thing that expressions do when they discover they're wrong and haven't fully decided how to rearrange themselves yet. He waved them through without apology, which was its own kind of answer. But the moment had been enough. Derek Voss had been standing 15 feet away, talking to a cluster of journalists and a photographer from an automotive magazine, and he had watched the whole thing with the attentive pleasure of a man who finds other people's awkwardness genuinely entertaining. Derek was Vero's VP of engineering. He was 41, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of square jaw that seemed engineered to appear in headshots. He wore a charcoal jacket over an open collar shirt and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never been in a room where he wasn't introduced first. He had arrived at Vero Motors 18 months ago from a consulting background with a resume that read beautifully and an ability to present other people's complexity in simple language that boardrooms loved. He had never personally designed a drivetrain. He had never sat with a set of thermal expansion calculations at 2 in the morning, trying to reconcile two conflicting tolerances. He had never held a part he built in his hands and understood from the weight of it exactly where the stress was going to concentrate. But he knew how to run a room, and right now he used that skill the way certain people always use their skills, to land on someone smaller and make it look effortless. Hey, he called across the lobby, not loud, just loud enough. Valet's out back if you need somewhere to park the Classic. He said classic the way people say words they mean as the opposite. The cluster around him laughed. One photographer actually lowered his camera to smile. An engineer near the press table grinned into his coffee. Two assistants exchanged a look that didn't need any words. Mace looked at Derek for a moment. Not with anger, not with recognition, which would come soon enough, just with the quiet, evaluating stillness of a man who has learned to look at things and see them clearly before deciding what to do next. He looked at Derek the way you look a load-bearing wall that isn't bearing the load it claims to be bearing. Noted. Filed. Not yet relevant. Then he looked down at Isla. She was already looking up at him. Her expression was the expression of a child who has absorbed a social situation and arrived at a verdict several seconds before the adults involved. Is that the man in charge? She asked. He thinks so, Mace said. She nodded slowly, with the thoughtful expression of someone filing information for later reference. He has very shiny shoes, she said. He does. But his jacket doesn't fit right at the shoulders. Mace looked. She was correct. The jacket was pulling slightly at the top seam in a way that suggested it had been chosen for how it looked hanging rather than how it moved. Good eye, he said. They found 2 seats near the back of the presentation hall and sat down. Isla pulled her notebook from her backpack and uncapped a pen. The GT9 was, objectively, a beautiful machine. Vero Motors had spent 4 years and approximately $340 million developing it. The platform was new, not a refresh, not a variant, an entirely original architecture built from a clean sheet, or so the press materials said. The chassis geometry was distinctive, a low-slung, forward-weighted layout that allowed for a battery integration approach nobody else in the segment had attempted. The thermal management system was elegant. The structural bonding technique used in the floor section was, to anyone who understood what they were looking at, genuinely novel. Renata Cole, no relation to Mace, a coincidence the universe apparently found amusing, stood at the front of the room beside a rotating display model and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had been building toward this moment for years. She was 54, silver-haired, and had run Vero since the company was a mid-tier part supplier trying to become something more. Under her, she had a reputation for directness and a lower tolerance for theater than her industry peers. She did not use words like paradigm or ecosystem in presentations, which made the automotive press trust her slightly more than the average executive. She described the GT9's platform with genuine knowledge. She talked about the frame geometry, the suspension calibration logic, the way the motor positioning affected weight transfer through corners. She used the right numbers in the right places. She was not reading talking points. She understood what she was describing. What she did not know, what almost nobody in that room knew, was that she was describing the work of a man sitting in the back row in a gray Henley. Mace listened in the particular way he listened to things, with his whole attention, but without any of it visible on his face. Isla drew in her notebook beside him, occasionally glancing at the screen when a diagram appeared, adding details to whatever she was working on with the unhurried focus of a child who has inherited a specific kind of patience. At one point, Renata described the rear subframe integration philosophy as a departure from conventional mounting geometry that allows for a more direct thermal pathway between the battery system and the chassis cooling loop. She described it in general terms, the language of a CEO who has been thoroughly briefed rather than someone who wrote the equations. Mace looked at the diagram on screen. He looked at the subframe geometry. He looked at where the mounting points were located in the diagram. He looked at that for 4 seconds. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in a way anyone around him would have clocked. Just the faintest tightening around the eyes of a person who has noticed something and is doing the calculation. The mounting angle was wrong. Not wrong in the design, his design had it right. Wrong in what was being shown on screen, which was the production specification. The production specification showed a simplified mounting geometry, 2 degrees off from the original isolation spec. His original spec had an isolation bracket at that mount. The bracket broke the resonance path before it could amplify. Without the bracket, at the right speed range, on real asphalt rather than simulation surface, the subframe would sing. A low harmonic, barely perceptible at first, becoming unmistakable at sustained highway speeds. He did not say anything. He was not there to say anything. He was there to watch. He sat in his seat in the back row and watched, and he knew what was going to happen before it happened, with the quiet, detached certainty of someone who wrote the outcome into the original equations and then watched someone quietly erase it. Isla looked at his face. She had her father's particular radar for hidden information. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She went back to drawing. She had, without him telling her, started sketching the rear subframe geometry from the diagram on screen. The fault showed up at 11:17 in the morning. Not during the presentation. During the calibration run on the test track behind the facility, where a pre-production GT9 had been taken out for a media demonstration lap. The driver, a professional who had done this at a dozen launches, felt it first as a vibration in the steering column at 67 miles per hour. He described it afterward as a harmonic, like something was resonating that shouldn't have been. Not dangerous, not immediately, but the kind of thing you don't ignore. He brought the car in and flagged it to the track team. By noon, 2 engineers had looked at it. By 12:30, 4 had looked at it. By 1 o'clock, the information had reached Derek Voss, who stood in the engineering bay with his arms folded and the expression of a man calculating options rather than solutions. This was, in itself, a diagnostic. Real engineers, when a car comes in with an unresolved fault 3 hours before a major production announcement, move toward the car. They crouch down. They look at things. They run their hands along components the way doctors press on soft tissue, feeling for something that shouldn't be there. They make the noise engineers make when they're thinking, the low internal hum of someone who has a theory they're not ready to announce yet. Derek Voss stood in the middle of the bay with his arms folded and looked at the car from a distance of approximately 8 feet. He did not crouch. He did not run his hands along anything. He had, in 18 months at Vero, developed a style of standing near technical problems that communicated gravity and oversight without requiring him to demonstrate specific knowledge of the technical problem itself. His lead dynamics engineer, a young woman named Priya Shun, watched him from across the bay with the expression of someone who has stopped expecting a different result but hasn't yet lost the small reflexive hope that they might be wrong. Priya had been at Vero for 3 years. She was 29, methodical, and had the particular quality of engineers who are genuinely good. She didn't soften findings to make rooms more comfortable. She had flagged 3 concerns during the GT9's development that had been addressed with modified documentation rather than modified designs, and she had stayed because she believed in the platform's underlying architecture in a way she couldn't entirely explain. It was a gut conviction. The bones of this car were right. Someone had built a genuinely good foundation, and then a series of people had made small modifications to it that were individually defensible and collectively eroding. Derek pulled her into the corridor. "Tell me it's calibration," he said. "It's not calibration," she said. "It's structural. There's a resonance node in the rear subframe that activates at a specific RPM band, right around 67 to 73 miles per hour. It's predictable, which means it's not random. It's baked into the geometry." "Baked into the geometry," Derek repeated. His voice had gone very flat. "The subframe mounting point angle," she said. "It's 2 degrees off from the isolation spec. At that speed range, it amplifies rather than dampens. It's subtle enough that it didn't show in simulation because the simulation modeled ideal surface conditions. On real asphalt, with real microvibration input, it's present. We have a 48-hour window before the production announcement needs to either go forward or get pulled." Derek stared at the floor for a long moment. How did this clear sign off? Priya looked at him with the particular expression of someone who knows where a question leads and has decided to let it arrive there on its own. It cleared because the original design spec had an isolation bracket at that mount point that got value engineered out 14 months ago. She said it carefully. The bracket was specified in the original architecture package. The package included a note in section 4.7 describing the bracket as a conditional requirement under deviation from nominal isolation geometry. When a mounting angle was simplified in the geometry revision, the bracket should have been flagged as essential rather than optional. It wasn't. Who decided it was optional? Priya chose not to answer that directly. "The original architecture package was written before I was hired," she said instead. "The author initials in the base file are MC. I've looked them up. The file came into our system when we acquired the platform IP from Halcyon Engineering 2 years ago as part of a broader portfolio transfer. The original architect is documented in the transfer paperwork. Nobody went back and read the original spec documentation thoroughly because the general assumption was that the design had already been reviewed and cleared before acquisition." Derek was quiet. He was doing what people do when a conversation is leading somewhere they don't want to follow, looking for an exit that has the shape of a reasonable decision rather than a retreat. "Can we fix it before 3 o'clock?" he asked. Priya gave him the kind of look that a good engineer gives a question that does not deserve a gentle answer. "We can put a Band-Aid on it that holds for a press lap," she said. "It won't survive production conditions. The geometry issue is structural. Temporary fix today, full review of the spec, and a restoration of the original isolation arrangement in the production design. That's what this needs. But that's a 2, maybe 3-day job minimum. We get through today, Derek said. He said it quietly, and the quietness of it was worse than if he'd said it loudly. Do what you can for the demo. We'll handle the production spec in the review cycle. Priya watched him walk back toward the main hall. She stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about 3 things in quick succession. She thought about the 4,200 units Renata was about to commit to in 2 hours. She thought about the people who would buy those units and drive them at 70 miles per hour on actual roads with actual asphalt. She thought about Section 4.7 and the initials MC and a name she had looked up once, 6 months ago, when curiosity had briefly overcome professional caution. She took out her phone. She looked up Mace Cole. She found him near the side exit, where Isla had discovered a low window ledge the perfect height for sitting, and had stationed herself there with her notebook, watching the test track with the focused attention of a wildlife photographer. Priya recognized Mace from a conference photograph she'd found 6 months ago when she'd gone looking for MC in the Halcyon records. He looked almost exactly in real life the way he looked in that photo, unhurried, attentive, with the quality of someone who is permanently slightly more interested in what's in front of him than in how he looks while looking at it. He was standing with a coffee he'd gotten from somewhere, and he was watching the GT9 in the bay through the glass with an expression that was not distress, not anger, not satisfaction. It was the expression of a man who already knows what the problem is and has already worked out the solution and is simply waiting for someone to ask. "Mr. Cole," she said. He turned. "Priya Shun. I'm a dynamics engineer on the GT9 program. I need to ask you something, and I apologize in advance for the fact that nobody with better manners thought to ask it before now." He looked at her. He looked at the car in the bay. He looked back at her. "The rear subframe mounting angle," he said. Priya blinked. 2 degrees off isolation spec, he said. "Active resonance node between 67 and 73 miles per hour. Shows up on real surface, not simulation." The isolation bracket got cut out of the build. He paused and took a sip of his coffee. "I know because I put the bracket in the spec for exactly this reason. And I know it's gone because I looked at the production geometry on the presentation screen this morning." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when someone gives you the answer before you've finished framing the question. "You already know," Priya said. "I heard the car come in 40 minutes ago," he said simply. "I know what that sound means." Isla, from her ledge, had been listening with the attentiveness of a child who knows when adults are saying something that matters. "Dad fixes things," she offered helpfully. "He's very good at it. He's also very humble about it, which I think is annoying, but he says is a virtue." Mace looked at his daughter. She went back to her notebook with the composure of someone who has made a contribution and considers it complete. "The fix isn't complicated," he said, turning back to Priya. "You need a 12mm isolation spacer at each of the 4 mounting points and a revised torque sequence for the subframe bolts. The geometry doesn't need to change. The resonance path needs to be broken before it amplifies. With the right parts, it's a 2-hour job, maybe less with a competent set of hands. Do we have the right parts?" The spacers are standard NVH isolation hardware. Any well-stocked shop carries them. I'd be surprised if your supply room doesn't have them already. Priya stared at him. She thought about Derek saying Band-Aid. She thought about the 3 engineers standing around the car, like men circling a problem and hoping it would clarify itself. She thought about 4,200 units. "Would you be willing to do the work?" she said. "Yes," he said. He said it without drama, without condition, without any of the performance of reluctance that people sometimes deploy before agreeing to things they fully intend to do. "We should probably not advertise who you are while this is happening," she said carefully. "I wasn't planning to," he said. He put down his coffee and walked toward the bay. What happened over the next 2.5 hours was not a movie moment. It was not a montage with swelling strings and meaningful glances. It was a man doing what he knew how to do, in a bay that smelled like brake cleaner and industrial rubber, with a precision that was almost meditative in its quietness. He didn't narrate his process. He didn't explain steps or announce findings. He moved through the job the way someone moves through familiar terrain, without hesitation, without false starts, without the slightly performative efficiency of someone trying to look impressive. He was not trying to look anything. He was working. Gerald Witten, the shop's senior machinist who had been at Vero for 19 years and had survived 3 ownership changes and 2 major restructurings by being irreplaceable and difficult to categorize, wandered over within 20 minutes and watched in silence. Gurr was 61, built like a filing cabinet, and had a face that suggested he had seen most things twice already and found the second occurrence less interesting than the first. He watched Mace locate the first mounting point, verify the existing torque spec against what the original documentation called for, and begin setting up the spacer geometry with the unhurried certainty of someone reading a language they wrote themselves. Said Gurr. That single syllable, delivered in Gurr's particular register, communicated a surprisingly complete paragraph. It meant, I see what's happening here. I know what kind of person this is. I've been waiting for something like this without knowing I was waiting for it. And also good. Without being asked, Gurr walked to the supply room. He came back 11 minutes later with exactly the additional hardware that was going to be needed in approximately 40 minutes, set on the bench within reach, and resumed watching. Priya handed tools when asked. She watched the sequence with the focused attention of someone trying to learn not just the steps, but the reasoning architecture underneath the steps. Why this tool? Why this sequence? Why the pause before that particular bolt? Twice, Mace did something she wouldn't have done, and both times it was correct, and both times she understood why a few seconds after watching it. That was the particular quality of watching someone genuinely good at something. You don't always see the logic in real time, but it arrives, and when it does, it feels obvious, which is the mark of something that was right all along. Isla had migrated from the window ledge to a 3-legged stool near the bay entrance. She had her notebook open. She was no longer drawing the exterior of the car. She was drawing the undercarriage as her father worked on it, adding labels in her small, careful printing, load path, mount point, resonance brake, with the calm industry of a child who is filing the world away for later. When Gurr passed her on his second trip to the supply room, he stopped. He looked at the notebook. He studied it with the serious attention of someone evaluating actual work rather than cute child output. Who taught you to draw that? He asked. Dad, she said, without looking up. And also I just looked at it and drew what I saw. Gurr considered this. He looked at Mace's back across the bay. He took a slow breath. He said again, and this one had different content than the first. Something like, the world occasionally makes sense. He went back to the supply room. At 2:43 in the afternoon, Mace tightened the last bolt in the revised torque sequence, sat back on his heels for a moment with the stillness of someone completing a thought, and said, Run it. The test driver, who had been hovering at the edge of the bay for the better part of an hour with the particular restlessness of professional drivers when cars are not moving, got behind the wheel without further encouragement. He pulled out onto the track access road. The engine note rose, fell, rose again as he found the straight. Priya had a tablet showing live telemetry. She was watching one specific readout, the resonance frequency plot at the rear subframe mount. The car accelerated. 40 miles per hour. 55. 65. The line was flat. 67. 70. 73. Flat. 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 Clean across the band where the harmonic had been singing all morning. Nothing. The noise floor was so quiet it looked like a mistake in the data. The driver came back in. He got out. He stood beside the car and looked at the undercarriage and then looked at Mace with the specific expression of someone who has been given back something they were told they couldn't have. It's gone, he said. Whatever was there is completely gone. Mace picked up a rag and cleaned his hands. He did it with the same unhurried motion with which he'd done everything else. No flourish. No visible satisfaction that could be described as pride, just the natural completion of a sequence. The isolation bracket in the original spec, he said to Priya, in the voice of someone making a note rather than a point. It needs to go back into the production design before this goes into manufacturing. The spacers today are a field correction. The permanent solution is restoring the original geometry. Section 4.7 has the complete specification. Don't deviate from it. I know, she said. He nodded. He set down the rag. He went to find Isla. He would have left then. He had thought about dinner, about the drive across town, about a promise involving pasta. The truck was in the lot. The keys were in his pocket. The afternoon was recoverable. He was 20 feet from the parking lot exit when Renata Cole stepped through a side door and said his name. She said it with the particular weight of someone who has spent 40 minutes reading a person's history and is now experiencing the disorientation of seeing that history standing in front of them in work boots and a gray Henley. Mace Cole. He stopped. He turned. Renata was not a woman who showed rattled easily. She had navigated a near-bankruptcy restructuring, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and a regulatory investigation that had lasted 11 months and produced 0 findings, because she ran a company that actually did what it said it did. Through all of that, she had maintained the composed forward momentum of someone who had decided that panic was a resource expenditure she simply couldn't justify. But right now, with a tablet in her hand and a quality of stillness around her eyes that was not composure so much as the careful assembling of composure, she looked like a person who had just finished reading a chapter and realized she'd misunderstood the whole story from the first page. "I've been looking at your name in our system for the last 45 minutes, she said. "The IP transfer documentation from Halcyon Engineering. The base architecture files. The original GT9 platform spec." She held the tablet out fractionally, a gesture more than an offer. "MC. Mace Cole," he confirmed. "You designed the chassis." "I designed the chassis, the subframe geometry, the thermal integration layout, and the battery housing structural interface. I also wrote the NVH isolation spec that included the bracket that was removed 14 months ago." He said without accusation, without drama. It was simply what was true. "I sold the IP when Halcyon needed liquidity. The terms of the sale transferred all attribution and commercial rights to Halcyon, which then transferred to Vero. I understood what I was signing." "Why didn't you," she started, "say something when I arrived?" "Because I wasn't here to say something. I was curious about the car." He paused. "And then the car came in with a fault, and that became a different situation." Renata was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular tone of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they didn't go looking for and are now obligated to deal with it. "The bracket removal," she said. "Who approved it?" This was the question that had been building all afternoon. Priya had known the answer since 1 o'clock. Gur had known within 20 minutes of watching Mace work, because old machinists learn to read the shape of decisions from the residue they leave in metal. The 2 engineers who had been standing uselessly around the car all morning had suspected it and hadn't said it out loud, because some things are above certain pay grades and below certain courage thresholds. It was Derek Voss who had approved the bracket removal. In a cost review 14 months ago, in a meeting that produced a 17-page summary and one decision that took approximately 45 seconds to make. The bracket had been described in that meeting as redundant hardware at current design parameters. The engineer who had flagged it as potentially non-redundant had been told the simulation results were sufficient and had not pushed back with enough force or enough documentation to create a record that survived the decision. That engineer had left the company 9 months later. Renata already knew this by the time she was asking Mace about it. Priya had provided the paper trail in a 20-minute briefing that Renata had absorbed with the compact efficiency of someone who has learned to process information quickly when the information is bad. What she was doing now was not information gathering. It was something closer to witnessing, making sure that the person who had actually done the work she'd been describing in presentations all morning understood that she now understood what she was dealing with. "I need to ask you something direct," she said. "Go ahead." "Derek Voss. What do you know about his actual engineering background?" Mace looked at her. He considered the question with the mild patience of someone who has already decided they will tell the truth and is just organizing how much of it belongs in this moment. "I don't know him personally," he said, "but the decision on the bracket is consistent with a particular type of engineering leadership. People who are very good at evaluating work in presentation form and genuinely believe that assessment is the same skill as the underlying work. They're not dishonest. They just never been in the room when a decision like that one proves itself right or wrong in metal at 70 miles per hour. The feedback loop that teaches the lesson is missing from their biography. Renata looked at him for a long moment. That's a very restrained way to describe it, she said. It's accurate, he said. She nodded. She turned the tablet over in her hands once. There was a quality to the silence between them that suggested a great deal of recalibration happening very quickly. I want to offer you a consulting arrangement, she said. Formal. The number is meaningful. Tell me the number after I tell you what I'll do, he said. I'll do a full review pass on the NVH section of the production spec, not just the bracket, everything. If there are other places where the original spec got simplified in ways that carry risk, I'll flag them. That's a 2-day job, maybe 3. After that, I'm in my shop. We should talk about a longer arrangement, Renata said. We can talk about it, he said. That doesn't mean we'll arrive at one. She looked at him with the expression of someone reassessing a situation they thought they understood. Not uncomfortable. Actually the opposite. The slightly bracing quality of dealing with someone who is exactly what they appear to be. Why did this morning, she said. Not me specifically. What was done to you at the entrance? I'm not here about the entrance, he said. He said it cleanly, without the forced ease of someone performing forgiveness. He simply had no investment in the morning's small cruelty because he had stopped measuring himself by whether rooms recognized him a long time ago. Renata looked at him, then at his daughter, who had appeared at his elbow in the way that children appear, quietly, suddenly, without ceremony, and was looking up at Renata with the open assessment of someone taking accurate inventory. He fixed your car, Isla said, not accusingly, just as a fact that seemed relevant to whatever conversation the adults were having. He did, Renata said. Isla nadith. Verdict recorded. She looked up at her father. Pasta, she said. Pasta, he confirmed. The conversation that followed between Renata and Derek Voss was not, in the end, a dramatic scene. It happened in a conference room on the second floor, with Priya present as documentation and a company attorney joining by video. Derek spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting operating in the mode of a man who believes that the right framing can redirect any conclusion. He talked about project velocity, about competitive pressures, about the difficulty of maintaining documentation fidelity under launch timelines, about collective decision-making and shared accountability. Renata let him talk. She was good at this. She had learned, over years of running a company where a lot of people were very good at talking, that the most efficient way to let someone reveal themselves was to give them an uncontested audience and a little time. Then she asked him 3 questions. The first, what is the resonant frequency threshold of the original isolation bracket at the GT9's design operating speed range? The second, what is the formula for calculating the NVH transmission coefficient at the rear subframe mount under the revised geometry? The third, can he explain the load path documented in section 4.7 of the original structural spec and why the isolation bracket was classified as a conditional requirement rather than a fixed one? Derek answered the first question with a reference to the team's simulation summary. He answered the second with a statement about trusting his engineer's analysis. He did not answer the third in any form that contained technical content. The room held the specific silence of a verdict that has been reached without anyone raising a voice. I'm not asking these questions to put you in an impossible position, Renata said. Her tone was the tone of a scientist describing a finding, not a prosecutor making a case. I'm asking them because a man who arrived here this morning in a vehicle that your lobby staff found amusing answered all 3 of them in passing, while cleaning his hand with a shop rag, before anyone had even formally told him what the problem was. She looked at Derek. His name has been in our base architecture files for 2 years. Nobody in engineering leadership went looking for it. A pause. That is a failure of this organization that I own part of, she said. The bracket decision and the information that should have stopped it belongs to a different accounting. The rest of the conversation was administrative. Derek's departure from Vero was announced 2 weeks later as a mutual transition. His press statement used the word opportunities 4 times in 6 sentences. He moved back to consulting, which is where people go when they are better at presenting engineering than doing it, and where that particular gap is sometimes less thoroughly examined. 2 weeks after the launch, the internal engineering review that Renata commissioned produced a 34-page report. 11 of those pages were devoted to the original architecture documentation and the chain of decisions that had modified it between acquisition and production. The report used the language that professional reports use: restrained, precise, specific, but the picture it drew was not restrained at all. An independent reviewer, a structural engineer from a university research program with no connection to Vero or its history, described the GT9's original platform spec as a remarkably integrated approach to chassis architecture that demonstrates deep intuition for the interaction between thermal, structural, and dynamic systems. The original spec had anticipated 3 of the issues that emerged during the GT9's development process and had built solutions directly into the design, solutions that had subsequently been modified or removed as the engineering process advanced under leadership that was better at managing the process than evaluating the substance. The review recommended that future platform acquisitions include direct consultation arrangements with original design authors where attribution could be established. It also recommended a restructuring of the engineering leadership function to require demonstrated technical competency at the senior level, not merely demonstrated competency at presenting technical work. The GT9 launched on schedule. All 4,200 production units went out with the restored isolation brackets and the revised subframe documentation. Early road tests produced glowing write-ups. One reviewer described the high-speed dynamics as composed in a way that feels structurally confident rather than electronically managed. Another wrote that at highway speed, the car seems to understand what it's doing in a way that inspires corresponding trust in the person driving it. Nobody in the press had a name to attach to that observation. But in a small shop on the east side of the city, in the evenings after Isla was in bed, Mace Cole read the reviews on his phone and set the phone down on the workbench and went back to the academic paper on composite material fatigue under thermal cycling that he'd been working through this week. Not because he needed to, not because it was professionally necessary, but because the questions it asked were interesting and he had always believed that interesting questions were their own. Justification. Renata's offer of a formal consulting arrangement sat in his email unanswered. Not because he was undecided, because he was thinking about it carefully, the way he thought about everything that would cost him time that belonged to Isla. He would respond eventually. He always responded eventually. He simply took the time a decision deserved, and not 1 minute more. The last thing that happened, the thing that mattered most despite being the smallest, occurred on a Saturday morning in late October. The school had an open day, the kind where parents wandered through classrooms looking at children's displayed work and try to find genuine things to say about drawings of animals and math worksheets. Isla had done a project on engineering and structures. It was on a fold-out display board in the hallway, titled in her careful printing, "How Things Stay Together." She had built a small model of a suspension component from cardboard and wire. She had labeled all the load-bearing points with colored arrows and short explanations. She had written a paragraph underneath about the concept of resonance, about how some frequencies destroy things, and some frequencies hold things steady, and how the difference between them is usually something very small that someone decided mattered or decided didn't. The teacher had made one comment on the paragraph. It said, "Excellent. Where did you learn this?" Isla had written back in the margin, "My dad. Also, I just thought about it." A man standing next to Mace reading the display was one of the other parents, casual jacket, coffee cup, good-natured face. He read the paragraph and then looked at the cardboard model and then looked at Mace. "Did she build that herself?" the man asked. "She did," Mace said. "That's impressive. Is she interested in engineering?" Mace looked at his daughter, who was across the hall making Isla-style commentary to her friend B about someone else's volcano project, hands moving expressively, ponytail coming undone, a small and total force of nature in star-printed boots. "She's interested in everything," he said. "The engineering will probably find her." "What do you do?" the man asked, the way adults ask each other this at school events, not because they're especially curious, but because it's what the moment calls for. Mace thought about how to answer that. He thought about it with exactly the amount of time the question deserved, which was not long. "I fix things," he said, "and sometimes I build them." The man nodded, sipping his coffee, moving on down the hallway with the mild contentment of someone who has exchanged the correct number of words with a stranger and is satisfied. Isla appeared at Mace's elbow. She had caught the last part of the conversation. "You also design a whole car platform," she said. "Sure," he said. "Dad, you literally designed the chassis geometry and the thermal interface spec and the... What do you know those words?" She gave him the look that said, "Dad, I live with you, and I listen to everything, and I have been listening to everything since I was approximately 2. "I know those words," she said, "because I have ears." He took her hand, and they walked toward the gymnasium, where there was orange juice and an enormous quantity of baked goods and the specific, uncomplicated warmth of a Saturday morning that had no agenda beyond itself. The truck was in the school parking lot. Rusty, cracked dashboard, primer patch on the hood, a small paper sunflower taped to the dashboard vent that Isla had made in art class 4 months ago. Sitting between a modern crossover and a sensible family sedan with the absolute indifference of something that has never needed anyone's permission to exist exactly as it is. Because here's the thing about a truck like that, about a man like that. The world spends a lot of its energy telling you what things are worth based on how they look arriving. The lobby, the badge, the shoes, the jacket that fits right at the shoulders, the car in a lot. And some people have learned, either by choice or by necessity, that those signals are measurements of the wrong thing. That the weight of a person is in what they can do and who they protect, and whether their word is accurate, and whether, when the car comes in at 67 miles per hour with a resonance fault that nobody else could name, they set down their coffee and go fix it. Without announcement, without negotiation, without needing the room to understand what it's watching. Mace Cole fixed the car because the math was interesting and someone was going to get hurt if it stayed broken. That's the whole story. And the whole story is enough. On the truck's dashboard, taped to the cracked vinyl in a spot that caught the morning light, was a drawing Isla had made 3 years ago when she was 5, a man with a wrench standing next to a truck, both of them roughly the same size, which was either artistic error or profound insight, depending on how you looked at it. Underneath, in the shaky printing of a child who is still learning how letters worked, "My dad fixes things." He is the smartest, boring person alive. He had never taken it down. He was never going to. If this story found something in you, if you've ever been the person in the parking lot that the room laughed at before they needed you, leave a like. It tells this channel that stories about quiet people doing extraordinary things are worth making. And subscribe, because there's always another one of these waiting. Another overlooked person, another rusted truck, another room that went very still when it finally understood what was standing in it.